Hello and welcome to EX Law, a new podcast from Customer Experience Magazine, where we're going to be uncovering what it takes to build a better employee experience. I'm Becky Norman, I'm the EX editor at CXM, and this is a show for anyone who wants to make work better for their people. Across the series, I'll be speaking to people leaders about the challenges they've faced, the initiatives and the projects they've run, and the lessons they've learned along the way. And I'll also be bringing in thought leaders to explore emerging trends shaping the world of work. So in this first episode, I'm really delighted to be speaking to Jane Austin, who is HR Director at Wave Utilities. Jane, hello, welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm thrilled to be the first episode.
I know, very exciting. So we're going to be diving into what's a really interesting story about how you were essentially crafting the culture at Wave from scratch. But before we get into that, let's just start with you. Tell us who you are, what you do at Wave. Tell us a little bit about Wave as well. Let's start there.
Sure. So Wave is a B2B water retail company that was set up on the 1st of April 2017 when the market deregulated. So all business customers left the kind of traditional water companies that you'd be aware of, Thames Water, Northumbrian Water, etc. And they all went into a competitive market, which was the new water retail market. And so Wave was one of those new water retailers that set up on the day the market opened. We began with 70 employees on day one, something I'm sure we'll touch on. And we now have approximately 340 employees. And I've been around since before day one. So I had the luxury of setting the company up along with what is still our CEO and setting up leadership team, getting the first employees in, etc. I have some exciting news, actually, Becky, that I didn't tell you beforehand. So as of yesterday, I have a new job title, which is Director of People and Social Value, because my role has kind of developed over the years, and I'm spending a lot of my time leading our social value strategy as well, which is kind of inextricably linked to culture and people and communities. So I guess that's me in a nutshell.
Wow, what a scoop. Thanks for sharing here first. Okay, well, we'll talk a little bit more about that new role. But first, let's go to Wave's founding story, which is pretty unique, and one where that culture, you were able to kind of really shape it from day one, and you weren't having to, come into an organization and look at the problems and what you needed to fix. Can you take us back to that starting point? How did you approach, starting from ground zero?
I remember it well. I think it was driven by fear. It was literally a step into the unknown. I'd never been in a situation of a startup company, and there's not many times in your career really where you get the opportunity to set up a company that doesn't need your own sort of personal money. So it was something. I think I bit their hands off. But I'd worked in Northumbrian Water for the preceding sort of 9-10 years. And Northumbrian Water, as a wholesale water company, had decided it did want to set up a new company to enter this market. It would have to be a completely separate legal company. I was in the HR team there, and they asked if I would like to be on the project team to start working towards setting up this new company. So that's what I did. We had just over a year's run into that. And very, very early on, we appointed what would become our CEO and is still our CEO, Lucy Darch. Lucy joined from British Gas. So she had years of experience at Enron and British Gas, etc. And I had the kind of water experience and sort of, wider HR experience. And we were brought together to really set up what an org structure would look like, even considerations about we had to find a building, how many employees would we start with, we had to write policies, decide about culture and all kinds of things. And then slowly we brought more people on to be part of that journey. So it was just a leap of faith at that point. I don't think either of us could imagine how we would get from that day of just talking about this concept to on the 1st of April, knowing that we would have 70 odd employees and a building and a name. We didn't even have a name. Um,
Wow.
and we met, Lucy and I met, and it was, I've told this story to many people, but I can picture the office in Northumbrian Water's headquarters building that we met. And we just decided to get to know each other as people. And that probably set the tone for everything thereafter. And what we did is we sort of shared, we shared about our personal story. We shared about our career experiences. And it was unintentional, but what we fell into was talking about the things that we'd loved in our career and the things that we really hadn't enjoyed in our career. And they were two different career stories, but they had the same themes. And from that, we knew that between the two of us, we very easily could, I guess we could bring to life the stories of what had not been great experiences, managers that we hadn't liked working for, policies that we'd found restrictive, company practices that we thought, just slowed innovation down or didn't lead to kind of efficiencies or collaboration, that kind of thing. And then we told the stories of the things that we'd loved, the highlights of our career. And it usually involved a culture or a person, an inspiration, someone giving you the freedom to do something. And as we kind of talked that through, we knew that we would be aligned in how we wanted the company to be. And it was those first conversations that set that culture that's still there today and has grown in Wave over the last 9 years.
Oh, yeah. Y- yeah, just taking that lived experience from both of you and then being able to set out what you're planning to do, with intention.
Yes.
What an amazing story. And you mentioned you started with 17 employees and you've grown now to around 300. Is that right?
Yeah. It was 70 on day one.
Oh,
Um,
70.
so 10 of those 70 were actually being tupied across from Northumbrian Water. They were predominantly, well, it was Lucy and I. Generally, they were account managers that were currently in Northumbrian Water were handling the business customers that were going to transfer to this new organisation. So we had a group of 10 that came with Northumbrian Water background. But Lucy and I had scoped out what we thought was the right structure for day one, and that was around 70. So then we had 60 employees to go and find. But what you've got to remember is we knew we would have to go and find and recruit these employees, but we still had to find a name, and we didn't have a building to put anybody, and we didn't have any terms and conditions. So that journey it was a rapid journey, and it was things that I'd never done in my career. I'd never had to write an entire set of HR policies from scratch. We had to have new contracts, all of the kind of policy decisions. We needed a pension scheme. These were things that I think you alluded to this in the first question, but all of my previous work experience had been in very large corporates. In fact, I think Northumbrian Water at 3,000 employees was the smallest organisation I'd worked in. A lot of my background had been in the car industry. And at the peak, when I worked for Rover and BMW, they employed 37,000 employees. So I walked into roles where everything from an HR point of view was there. It was written. It was potentially negotiated. It was tried and tested. And then suddenly it dawned on me that I had to set up a pension and I had to determine the rewards and shape what we were going to write in the policies. So it was a huge, huge learning curve. And I really did learn a lot. But I also had good people that I kind of had been colleagues over my career that I could reach out to. And, I knew somebody in Northumbrian Water that was the pensions expert and kind of said, talk me through where do I even start? And there were a lot of people that were willing to give me a crash course in things. And then the rest, if you've got enough determination and enough passion, you learn the rest. And actually, I think it was a better result because you make mistakes along the way. What you're trying to do is create something. You're not trying to replicate something. And what happened on that journey is we ended up with some things that were better than I ever had in the large corporates. And that's not saying anything negative about large corporates. But what you tend to do is you repeat what you've always done. And you've got very large budgets. Actually, we just had these little tiny budgets. And some of the things that in all of my career I had deemed to be basic HR components, a pension scheme, perhaps the most memorable one is an occupational health scheme. I'd never questioned their existence, but I'd also seen that what happens is nobody ever stops and says, do we still need occupational health? Nobody says, is there a different way of doing this? You just say, let's go out to market and, get the most competitive tender. Whereas suddenly for the first time, I didn't have the budget for an occupational health scheme. And I think that was probably my scariest moment, because what Lucy and I had agreed from day one is that the culture would be very employee focused with a very, very large cultural priority of well-being. And it was something that mattered to both of us personally and individually. So well-being was going to be at the absolute heart of Wave. But then the penny dropped that I couldn't actually afford an occupational health service. So how was that going to work? And anybody I spoke to in other organisations, they didn't have any answers because they had one and they'd never not had one. There was nobody I was talking to that was able to say, I struggled, we couldn't afford one, and this is what we've done. So that was probably my hardest startup moment. And I went to this wonderful conference called the Richmond HR Forum, where they match you with suppliers. And I met a little broker. I said to her, here's my dilemma. I have this budget for either group income protection or critical illness. So, having some advice about which one I would go to would be wonderful. But my problem is I don't have the money for an occupational health scheme, and it's just integral to what we want to do. And she said, I think I know the solution to this problem. So they went away, and what they came back with was a group income protection scheme that we could afford. And free of charge with that scheme came an early intervention medical scheme. Now, technically on paper, it's not occupational health. It was something different. But it allowed us to refer people, or either the HR team or managers could refer into this early intervention scheme, and the employee would be triaged by specialist nurses, including psychiatric nurses. So any employee that said they were struggling, they didn't have to be off sick. Any employee that said they were struggling, either with something to do with physical health or mental health, could then be triaged within pre-COVID, within 28 to 48 hours, either at their home address or in the workplace. And suddenly I was getting a service that was better than some of the very, very expensive occupational health schemes that I'd worked with in large corporates. This wonderful scheme we've had right from the beginning. We still have it now. And I think it's just one of those examples of when you take nothing for granted and you go back to basics and you define what you want, you are actually so much more creative.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's quite often this belief, particularly among SMEs where budgets are a little bit tighter, you've got a smaller team, that you need this big budget to shape culture in a meaningful way that, actually lasts. It's not just like a tick box initiative. And that obviously feels really challenging to those people leaders. But obviously you've learned a lot from this, that you just need to be creative, experimental, and there is always a way through.
I think that the early intervention medical scheme, that was the bit that taught me that lesson. And when I've talked to other SME organisations, it's the message I always give is, you know what, it can be slightly frustrating because you might not achieve what you want to achieve as quickly as you would in a larger corporate where you have the funding behind you. But my experience, you sometimes get a better result. And another experience I had was with an employee survey. So it was almost every HR job that I'd done in my career. Somehow the employee survey always found me. And so I've worked with really large providers right from my very, very early career. And the employee surveys, they tended to be anything between 50 and 100 questions. Back in the car industry, we took people off the production line. We kind of gave them a cup of tea and a bacon sandwich. It was always like bribing people to fill the survey in. But you then have to analyze those 100 questions. What you find is, the classic, you told us we did kind of feedback, and there's nothing wrong with that in the right context. But when you're on the receiving end of that feedback about an employee survey, most people walk away sort of saying, oh, well, they listened to one of my ideas. But the classic question I can remember when I was sort of there encouraging people to fill in surveys is employees would often say, why did they ask me whether I felt I was paid fairly? Because when I said no, and when all of the colleagues I knew said no, nothing changed. They didn't change our pay. So why did they ask? And in sort of psychological terms, a really good employee survey, the questions should all be what's referred to as drivers for change. So if you don't intend to change, or you can't change something, then don't ask the question, because all you're doing is raising expectations and not delivering. So again, I went to the Richmond HR Forum and said, look, if you've got any employee survey organisations and suppliers here. And I met a few and they didn't get it and it wasn't right for us. And then I found this little company. They too were a relatively new organisation set up by organisational psychologists. They were based in Brighton. And they said, oh, look, we've kind of torn up the rule book and we just have 16 questions, but everyone is a driver for change. I thought, that's it. I found my survey. They got it. And we still use that today. I think we started with that survey in, I can't remember if it was 2018 or 2019, but we've stuck with them. And we as a leadership team, we accept and we know that if the feedback comes back to say that one of these are wrong, it is within our control to do something about it. So we're not asking questions that we don't intend to do anything about. We're asking questions that we know we might need to do something about if the feedback isn't positive. So you don't need the big budgets. You just need to go out and ask the questions and find the right things for you.
Yeah. Because there's a lot of data out there that shows that there's this perception gap where leaders feel that they're acting on feedback and employees don't feel like that. So I think that's really helpful what you're saying. Only ask the questions where you're able to potentially change things. I know that feedback is really important to you and well-being is really important to you. And you're also tied into employee feedback. You really listen to your employees, and I know that they're quite forthcoming with ideas for you. And one thing that you mentioned to me in a previous chat was the Living Library program. Could you tell us the story about that, how that came about and what it's about and the impact you've had with it?
Yeah, this is one where I wish it had been my idea, because it's one of the best I've come across. But it wasn't. It was one of our employees' ideas, which is nicer in a way. So we have, over the years, we've developed a health, safety and wellbeing forum. We actually have a combined health, safety and wellbeing strategy. That strategy for us now is about mental wellbeing, physical wellbeing, financial wellbeing, and we've actually added social wellbeing in 2025, which is all about human connection. So to make a strategy like that come alive, yes, it can be driven by people like me, by the HR team, but we knew, kind of leadership theory kind of says, it's great for you as leaders to start off with the ideas, but you need other people to have those ideas, because one day you run out of them and then your employees have never learned to think for themselves. So we wanted active engagement from our employees. So we developed this forum. I thought we would have to drag people kicking and screaming, but we have at times actually had a waiting list for people to go on this forum, because we've got an input
Wow.
from each kind of directorate, as we call them. And it's just one of those meetings that, every 2 months people look forward to. People talk about what they want. What do they want Wave to cover in wellbeing? Now, it wasn't always that way. It was kind of driven by me at the beginning, then driven by my team. Then employees started to say, could we have? And then it grew. And suddenly we have this incredibly active and passionate health, safety and wellbeing forum. And we were already running some wonderful kind of wellbeing campaigns. And we were asking this forum one day, what's next? And we had an employee who said, look, this might sound like a crazy idea, but kind of this is WAVE and people listen to crazy ideas. And what they came across, so they mentioned this thing called the Living Library, and I think it was Denmark. It's one of the Scandinavian countries, anyway, that have it at a society level. So people can volunteer to be a living book, and they would meet up with other people. So this employee said, I wondered if we could make it work in WAVE. So the concept is that employees would volunteer, and that is a key word. You can't be strong-armed into this. It would absolutely have to be volunteers. So people would volunteer to become a living library book, a human book. And that would involve them writing, a couple of paragraphs, maybe up to an A4 page, on something they had lived through. And this would be published on our intranet. And the idea was that they would be, by volunteering to do this, they would in effect be saying, if anybody out there, if any other employee is going through this, you can reach out to me. Now, the ground rules are you're not reaching out to that person for advice. They are not claiming to be an expert, particularly because there would be some medical stories probably being told. That was the absolute sort of ground rule. But sometimes when you're going through something, you might go to a doctor, you might go to a psychologist, you might talk to friends and family. But often what you hear people saying is, I just want to talk to someone that gets it. I want to talk to someone that's been through it. And this was what the Living Library was there to do. So she presented this idea and we kind of said, look, it's amazing, but who's going to volunteer? Really? Who's going to volunteer to tell their story about, I don't know, a baby loss, domestic abuse, ADHD, whatever it is? We know our culture's good, but that's kind of the next level. Are people really going to be willing to do this? And we talked about it as a group and we just said, if we didn't rush into it and we took our time to vocalize it, to tell the story, to explain what we wanted, maybe if we allowed it just to evolve, it would happen. And it did take about 12 months because we just started talking slightly wider. We talked to the leadership team. The people on that forum talked to their teams. We got more and more questions coming back. We worked our way through these questions. And I think we started with 10 living library books, and we now have nearly 40.
Amazing.
To the point that we have each book or book topic is an alphabetical tile on our intranet. So you go onto the living library, and it begins with ADHD, autism, bereavement, child loss, domestic abuse. I'm trying to do this out, but those stories. There are some positive stories in here. They're not all doom and gloom stories. There's some wonderful stories in there. Watching that grow has just been, it's an amazing thing. It's very brave as well. There are some really brave stories that are being told in there, and people have reached out to people for exactly the reason we intended, to just say, it might be a cancer diagnosis. I've got my diagnosis, I've got the medication, I'm going through treatment, but I wanted to reach out to you because I'd read your living library book, because I wanted to talk to someone that knew what it felt like. You can't buy that. We could never have bought this thing in. It didn't need money, this, but it did need the culture. The thing I was most proud of was a team leader that became a living library book, and she told this story about how she'd overcome a drug addiction. And it was quite a dark story. And she came to me just before it was going to be published and told me what was going to go on to the living library. And I still ask the question of, are you sure you feel comfortable doing this? Because there's no pressure ever on anyone doing this. And she said, I feel completely okay. This is WAVE. And at that point, you've cracked the culture. Because if you as a manager feel okay enough to reveal to the entire workforce that you once had a drug addiction, and you know there's going to be no judgment, then actually, A, it's a lovely position for employees to be in. B, it means that she will help other people. And C, for me, we talk about well-being metrics. That's your measure of culture.
What an amazing initiative. And I really hope this inspires people who are listening to look at doing it within their own organisation. I want to ask you a few just quick fire questions because we're coming to the close of the conversation. I could speak to you for a lot longer, but to sing your praises a little bit, you've won multiple awards, including the Best Company Culture at last year's Employee Experience Awards. What do you think Wave is doing that others aren't?
I guess the context is important. We did have the luxury of a startup. Although it's hard, we had the luxury of creating a culture. And I think that is important. That's not to say it can't be achieved if you're already in existence. But I would always say that has helped. But I think what sets Wave apart is we're very intentional about how we do things. We don't race into doing things. And if you talk to any of our suppliers, the phrase that they always say is that Wave never does anything to tick a box. There is nothing we do in the policies we write, in the benefits we introduce, in the way we treat people. We do it because it's the right thing to do. And it isn't always easy. And sometimes we have quite a lot of obstacles to overcome in persuading people to kind of go with us at this harebrained scheme, like the Living Library. You know, people initially write, we can't really do that in an organisation, can we? So it's not necessarily the easiest route we take, but we do it because we're passionate about culture and well-being. It's about asking questions and deciding what fits you in your organisation, in your culture. Not what everybody else is doing. It doesn't matter what everybody else is doing. Find what's right for you. And I think that sets us apart.
Brilliant. And on the flip side, what are you still figuring out, wrestling with when it comes to your culture and employee experience?
Yeah, I'd say there's one very obvious thing for me. In an organisation of our size where resourcing and budgets will always remain lower, it's very difficult to find the best way of recruiting people managers. So the biggest challenge for me is when we promote a technical manager, it's how we help them to learn the people management skills. Some people actually, even though they're technical experts, are still naturals. And that's an easy one. But when someone is perhaps struggles on the people management side, it is for us as an organisation to help them get there. And it isn't easy. And we do pretty well. You know, we have a really, really great approach to development, but I wouldn't say we had cracked that challenge in its entirety. So
Yeah. You wouldn't be alone in that,
no,
I don't think.
definitely not alone. But that's probably my biggest challenge.
Yeah. And my final question, I'm going to be asking every guest this for the next couple of episodes at least. We're living through relentless change and uncertainty right now. Feels like just the standard. And most organizations are struggling to support their people through that. What's the one thing that you think leaders consistently get wrong about supporting their people through major change?
That's quite an easy one for me, actually, because I've seen a lot of change in organisations I've worked with through the years. And I also spent a few years as the head of internal communications for BMW and Rover. So I was on the comms side of change, and I'd already come from the kind of HR side. So I guess I've seen it with two lenses. The classic mistake is the people that are leading the change understand why the change is needed. And because they do, off they go with their change program. Because they get it. They know what the end goal is and they get it. And everything, therefore, that they're putting into that change program makes sense to them. They don't stop. It's that same bit. They're not stopping. They're not asking the questions. So then you do this change in the organization, but most of your population are kind of sitting there thinking, but why? Or even if they get the big why, does it really need me to do that bit? Or, okay, I understand that we might need to streamline, but why did we choose that system over that system? Or Why couldn't they have trained me a bit better? Or all of those questions people are just left with. Nobody answers them. And when you have questions and when you don't understand something, that's when fear creeps in. The best way of doing change is to stand in the shoes of the most scared or the most resistant, or perhaps the least qualified. If you can stand in their shoes and understand what it feels like to dread a new system, or, take the person that is perhaps the technophobe, and they've learned how to operate Word, PowerPoint, and the billing system, for example, but you throw something else at them, and they just know it's going to be difficult. And what happens what I've seen happening in organizations is they don't even go and talk to those people. They talk to the ones that are going to do the user acceptance testing, the ones that are already very technically capable. Go and talk to your most scared. If you can communicate to them and you can train them and you can win them over, you will win everybody over. But it's always the other way round that I see. I've given a lecture at Durham Uni on change in organisations, and that is the lesson. Write your communications in the simplest form. So don't view it through the eyes of the change manager. View it through the eyes of the most resistant or the most scared. Win those over, and your change will happen.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Jane. And a really good soundbite there. Go and talk to your most scared. That is all the questions that I've had. Thank you so much for joining us on our first episode of EX Law. It's been really great to hear about everything that you've achieved at Wave, and perhaps we can catch up again soon when I'm sure you'll have more stories to tell.
Thank you.